All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about Introduction to Permaculture Session 2. We're going to do a quick review, and then after that, we're going to get into new content this evening. I will try and keep a little bit of a monitor on the chat window, but it's mostly going to be something that I pay attention to after we are done with tonight's session. So if you have questions, try and ask them or keep them till the end of the show so that I can capture it and make sure that I answer it for you. All right, so hopefully my screen share is coming up there, and we're going to get into it. All right, folks. So again, if you are just signing in for the first time, who is Verge Permaculture? Verge Permaculture is Michelle, myself, and my two kids, Rowan and Naomi. We've been going at this for about the last decade. Well, they haven't. They're kind of new to the scene, but Michelle and I have been. And if you haven't heard our story, we're originally from the oil and gas industry. We were working as pipeline engineers and decided that we wanted to find a better way to live our lives, but also to move the conversation forward, not to be part of necessarily status quo, but trying to discover solutions as opposed to always talking about problems, which is something that we found a lot in the oil and gas industry. So after receiving a YouTube video called Greening the Desert, we left our jobs. We traveled the world for probably 3 years in total: Australia, Middle East, Europe, parts of the United States, lots of Canada, lots of Mexico, and basically just went around the world at trying to deconstruct the myths that humans are inherently destructive. This myth that you've probably all heard of but never put words to, and trying to prove that we actually can be just as positive as we are negative. And so we did that. We came back fully convinced that this was actually possible, and we've dedicated our careers now to teaching permaculture right through Canada, and maybe one day around the world. So tonight we're teaching the intro course, which is the first course that I ever taught as a permaculture instructor many, many years ago. And it's a course that has a special place in my heart. It's action-packed, as action-packed as permaculture can get. I think it's pretty action-packed. And hopefully you'll get a ton out of tonight's presentation. As I've said multiple times, this is my favorite part of the introduction to permaculture. This is the piece tonight that completely changed my engineering career. This was the part of my engineering degree that was not included that should have been. So if you're an engineer or an architect, I think you'll get an enormous amount out of this because you'll find some innovation potentially in the way that you design. If you're a homeowner and you're not an architect or an engineer, you're still going to get tons out of this because it'll help you to conceptualize design in a whole new way. So if you're just signing in right now, make sure that you introduce yourself, let us know where you're calling in from, and let's get everybody to put down on the chat window something that they want to learn tonight. Make sure you introduce yourself to your fellow students. So as I said last time, we're going to be following the introduction to permaculture, and I think it's probably one of the best books out there. I've got my own copy here. It's got a slightly different cover, but still the same book. And you'll notice from time to time that I have a little page notation on the bottom right-hand or left-hand corner of the slide. And it basically is telling you where in the text I am. Believe it or not, this course only really goes through the first 15 or 20 pages of the book. It's an incredible book. I can't recommend it enough. So, all right. So why live on YouTube? So I recognized that when I first got into permaculture that there was very few resources out there that I could go and learn and look into that actually explained what permaculture is. And I joke that in our full 72-hour permaculture design course, it takes me a full 72 hours to break this concept down to people. And even afterwards, people leave and they still, you know, have to think more about what it is. It's because it's so huge. It's a behemoth. And so I wanted to put an introduction to permaculture out onto YouTube for the folks that are new to this concept of permaculture, that wanted the ability to be able to try before they buy, that wanted to see if it was a fit for them before they go and you know, take that big leap into a permaculture design course. And even if you don't take that leap, you're still going to get a ton of value out of tonight. You're going to learn a whole bunch about a design system that's aim is to create sustainable human habitat, to show how humans can be just as positive as they are negative. So this image is an image of our small urban homestead in Calgary. It's the resources that we had available to us. It's about 5,000 square feet. I think it's been fantastic to have a small project to kind of wet our feet with, if you will. It's shown us how much productivity you can get in a really small space. And you can see we've really packed it in there. We've got a passive solar greenhouse, a garden, a food forest. We capture most of our thermal energy for hot water with a solar hot water heater. We have solar lighting in our house. We're going to go through this entire case study towards the end of the course. I think it's session 8 or 9. So we'll make sure we spend a lot of time on how urban systems work, but we're also going to talk about rural systems in the case studies. So if you're going to stick through the whole program, the case studies are going to help to bring all of these concepts together at the end. So last time we talked about what is permaculture, what it is, a specific definition. I mean, the whole course is about what permaculture is. We talked about the prime directive of permaculture. We talked about the ethics and principles of permaculture. We talked about the industrial system and then compared it and contrasted it to the ecological system. And finally, we talked about the immature versus the mature ecosystems. And I'd be curious to know if people had some insights when we were looking at that slide, immature versus mature ecosystems. That's one of my favorite slides of all time, comparing the two systems side by side and the different characteristics of those systems. I'd be really interested to know if people found that interesting and insightful. So tonight we're going to talk about principles, so integrate rather than segregate. I'm actually going to take you through a workshop. I've never done this on YouTube before, so we'll see how it goes. I've got some fancy tools that we can use if we need to. And I'm actually going to do Q&A. I'm going to do a small Q&A session right in the middle of the course. Then I'm going to finish off with a couple of slides, and then we're going to do another Q&A session at the end. But the mid Q&A session is just going to make sure that you guys are following the workshop and it's making sense. So let's move into the primary content for tonight. Nice to see you, Jamie. Thanks for signing in. And as always, guys, as we're going through this, if the content is really resonating with you, please send me a like. It gives me a feedback. You know, I have to be honest, teaching in front of a video camera is a bit new, and I'm not, you know, overly comfortable with it yet. I'm getting better. But when I see those likes go up in the bottom, it lets me know that I'm doing the right stuff. So if you can take some time and put some likes there, I'd really appreciate it. And I will keep an eye on that from time to time. It also really helps if you share this on social media. I really appreciate that when you guys do that. So thanks so much. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about relative location. And again, you'll see that page number there, page 6. So this is needs and yields analysis. And this is the workshop that I'm really excited to give to you guys tonight. We're going to talk about another principle that every element should perform many functions. And we're going to talk about how each important function is supported by many others. This is the core of resilience in permaculture. It's the piece that doesn't get taught, at least not very effectively. And I'm hoping that I really instill some inspiration in you guys tonight to start thinking about your own systems through this lens. And I'm excited to see what comes of it. Okay, so each element performs many functions. This is a really important concept, and I think that the crux of this is that if you're going to spend money and time to build something, that you should make it do multiple things. And this, right now, what we're looking at is a rocket mass heater inside of my passive solar greenhouse. And I'll just go through the different functions that it serves, as well as the greenhouse itself. But I think that this idea can actually be applied in the way that you do business, in the way that you run your household, just generally how we live our lives. I think it's a very profound concept that that I use in all walks of life myself, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. So the rocket mass heater, as some of you might be guessing, is thermal mass for the passive solar greenhouse. So in the summertime, we don't fire it up. It just absorbs energy from the sun. And we live in a climate that gets pretty cold at night, even in the summertime. I always joke that you can judge how good of a growing season you have based on how many times you can sit out on a patio and drink a beer in the summertime. And here in Calgary, we're lucky to get 2 of those nights. So 2 nights in the summer, that's it. It's hard for me to even say it because it makes me jealous when I find out that people living in Ontario or even in parts of BC can be on the patio for most nights of the year. So basically, it gets really cold at night, and plants stop photosynthesizing when they go below about 12 to 10 degrees Celsius. Now, in US units, that's going to be around 40, 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So in a passive solar greenhouse, what we want to do is we want to store enough thermal energy during the summertime so that those plants stay in a situation that's warm enough so that they continue to grow. Now, plants won't photosynthesize at night because there's no sun, but they will continue to grow if it's warm enough. And so the rocket mass heater in the summertime is actually supplying that thermal energy that it's collected through the day. Now, it also is a bench. We use it to put our seedlings on when we're starting seedlings. And then in the wintertime, we can actually fire it up, warm it up, and it takes about 3 hours of burn time in order to charge the bench up sufficiently, because what's going on in a rocket mass heater is you're feeding it waste wood, which is another really cool thing about rockets. If you don't know much about rocket mass heaters, they're specifically designed to gasify wood and to use really low-grade wood so that you don't have to cut down massive trees in order to keep things warm. So they're very efficient, but they're also really effective. I could teach a whole course just on rocket mass heaters, actually. And so when you're actually combusting this in the wintertime, what's going on is the fire is gasifying the wood. The barrel itself is for quick heat. So as the flame goes through the system, you get quick heat off of the barrel. And then there's a flue that runs all the way through the bench. And there's about 2 to 3 metric tons in that bench there. And as the flue gases move through that bench, it actually picks up heat. The bench heats up over the course of about 3 hours. And then once we're not storing any more thermal energy, we just let the fire die. And that bench will release heat into the greenhouse for 12 to up to 48 hours. It depends on how cold it is outside. So the bench is thermal mass in the summertime. It's a space heater in the wintertime. It's a seedling starting bench. So the surface of the bench will get warm, which is good for seedlings. It's a place to sit and hang out in the winter or in the summertime. And then the greenhouse itself serves multiple functions. It's hail proof because we have a lot of hail where we are. It's also a hangout space. So when in the wintertime, when we need a little bit of extra sun, we can go out there and hang out. We actually hung a hammock in there this year, and my kids have started playing in there, which is really wonderful. And so there's lots of activities and things going on within this greenhouse. And so we're trying to always find ways to stack functions as much as possible. Every element is supported by many others. And so I think the organization that best embodies this is NASA. So NASA has this saying that 1 is 0 and 2 is 1, which is basically saying that if you don't have redundancy, then you don't have anything. And because NASA is so concerned about making sure that their astronauts are safe, because they're putting them into hugely difficult environments, space, you know, they really want to make sure that every single critical system has multiple elements. So what you're looking at there is, there's lots of examples in these two pictures. So number one, we'll start at the top. Our solar thermal collector heats all of our hot water, but we also have a backup hot water heater. So in the event that we don't get any sun, we can still have hot water if we choose to use it. On the roof, we've got solar tubes, and those solar tubes let sunlight in, which is how we light our house all year round. In the wintertime, we get a little bit less light. In the summertime, we get a little bit more. It's pretty funny. One of those tubes, the one kind of in the middle on the roof closest to us, is actually going into our upstairs bathroom. And it's hilarious when people come over to our house and they try and turn the light off and they can't because it's being lit by the solar tube. So the sunlight actually lights our house. We have backup lights inside in the event that it's dark outside or whatever. And then you'll notice that the whole roof itself harvests rainwater, and it's a little bit hard for me to show. I'll see if I can get my mouse over there to show you guys. So all this roof harvests an enormous amount of rainwater. It comes down this downspout right here into a tire pond and then overflows into a swale. Again, we'll go through this whole system a little bit later in the course. This swale, once it fills up, overflows, comes down into another garden swale down here. And you can see that this garden looks pretty awesome. There's no irrigation going on in here. It's all passively irrigated. We get about 1/3 of a meter or 300 mils a year, roughly 12 inches of rain. So very little rain. It's a very arid climate actually. And it's because we capture all of our rainwater, plus all the rainwater that falls on the garden actually is captured as well. And then what's hard to see is the back roof behind this solar panel. was actually causing a problem. And there's a saying in permaculture that the problem is the solution. So you don't have a turkey problem, you don't have a grasshopper problem, you have a turkey opportunity. Or you don't have a slug problem, you have a duck opportunity or a duck deficiency. Well, we had a water problem. We didn't have a water problem, we had a water opportunity. And so we needed to figure out how to get the water from the back roof to the garden when it overflowed, but also to store enough rainwater in here such that we could keep our greenhouse irrigated. And so what you're looking at right here is actually a patio. Okay, so this is a place that we can sunbathe or hang out when we have community gatherings, because right beside this is actually a giant cob oven. But the patio itself, you can see the water coming out of the hose right here is sloped. And so this actually is not just a patio, it's also a rainwater harvesting surface. And so as the water flows over the patio, it gets picked up in this scupper right here. And then underneath these bricks, we've got 4 giant culverts, which is supporting the bricks on top. And so we've actually created a patio cistern roof. And this is the water that we use to irrigate all of our greenhouse crops. And this is how we took care of that water problem on the back of the roof and turned it into a water opportunity. So you'll see that we've got city water, we've got rainwater, we're collecting all the water off of our roofs. The garden is obviously going to be collecting a lot of that rainwater. You can even see on the foreground here, the garage roof is actually collecting all the rainwater as well, and that's going into that bottom swale right there. There's actually a video on how we built this rain tank on YouTube that you can watch. If somebody has seen it and you want to post it up into the chat, that'd be really appreciated. Rianne is asking, do you have any issues with heaving in the winter, spring due to freeze thaw in your cisterns? Great question, Rianne. And the answer is no, because the cisterns that we have on this property all get drained down. This Friday, speaking of rainwater, I'm teaching a whole course at 3 o'clock Mountain Standard Time on rainwater harvesting. And I'm going to go through all of those questions in detail, but I'm happy to address them at the end of the program as well on how we freeze protect our rainwater systems. Great question, and nicely placed in terms of when to ask it. So again, if someone can pull up the video on my YouTube channel around how we built a cistern out of this back patio here, I think you'll find it quite interesting, and you guys can watch it a little bit later. I can also try and remember to put it in the show notes as well. So every element is supported by many others. So this is the piece of the workshop that I find most, not just entertaining, but interesting. And so within every element, we can define that element's needs, okay, and its yields, its products or behaviors, and its intrinsic characteristics. And so the needs are basically, what does that element need in order to thrive or survive or function properly? Its products or behaviors, or what does it produce as a result of it being? And then its intrinsic characteristics, now this is specifically for a chicken, are the things that are specific to its specific breed. So is it cold tolerant? Is it rain resistant? Like some chicken feathers are more resistant to rain than others. Some work better in wet climates basically than in dry climates. There are intrinsic things that different breeds have and bring to the table. And so we want to understand what those are. Now, this example is very much of a biological system, like a chicken, which is awesome because biology is amazing. And if we're not working with biology, we're not sustainable or regenerative. However, you can do the same process with a natural gas boiler, with a solar panel, with a rain tank, with a cob oven, with a passive solar greenhouse, with a regular greenhouse, with a garden, with a cafe, with a business. It doesn't really matter. Everything that we design as humans has needs and yields. And the process of design is merely just a process of trying to match make, essentially. And so when we're doing design, we have the power of placement, but we don't always have the power of connection, which I'll get into a little bit more detail a little bit later. Thanks, Veta, for putting that up. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, whether it's Vita or Veta, but I appreciate you putting that link up there. So the chicken here has specific needs, and there's shelter, so it needs a place to live. Grit, so chickens don't have teeth. They've got a crop and a gizzard to help crush their food. It needs dust because it dust bathes. It needs water, air, food, and other chickens. It produces eggs, meat, feathers, manure, methane, CO2, scratching, foraging, flying, and fighting. There's a product or behavior or a yield that's missing here, and that's entertainment. Anybody that's had chickens knows that they are absolutely hilarious, and it should be on this product list there. I should make a little arrow that says entertainment. And then the intrinsic characteristics are going to be based on breed, the color of the chicken, climate tolerance, and breed-specific behavior. And so we can break every element down into these needs and yields. And this is the first step of good design, in my opinion, and the step that largely gets missed or ignored. So let's go through a specific example together, and then I'm going to give you guys a bit of a workshop that you can go off and work on after today's session. And if you want, I'd love to see some of them, so you guys can send an email to info@vergepermaculture.ca, and you can show me some of your designs, and perhaps we can bring that into next week's presentation as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that might look like in terms of what you need to produce. But we're gonna show something, an example right now. So in front of you, you've got a compost pile. So let's go through the needs and yields of this compost pile, and I'm going to do it pretty quickly. I'm just going to flash up both the needs and the yields, and then we'll go through each one of them individually. So the needs of a compost pile include labor, oxygen, nitrogen or greens, but nitrogen can come in multiple different forms. It can also come in manure, phosphorus, potassium, microbes, water, carbon. If you don't know what I mean by carbon, things like wood chips, leaves, anything that's brown, mostly so, not including coffee grounds, of course, because coffee is actually really high in nitrogen. But basically, any good compost pile needs a balance between carbon and nitrogen. And generally speaking, we want that balance to be between 30-to-1 and 50-to-1. So 30-to-1 is what you're going to read about in most composting books. So if you have a composting pile that is smelly or slimy or is just not very nice to be around, most likely you've either got too much water in there or you've got too much nitrogen, not enough carbon. Very rarely do I see clients where they are putting enough carbon into the compost pile. And I should just mention that when you're putting carbon in, you want to make sure that the wood material that you're putting in is not allelopathic. So things like cedar mulch is not a good option. Ideally, you're going to be using wood mulch from, if it's conifers, the conifer should be well digested. So it should be 6 months to a year old. And the way to test whether the wood chips are old enough is to literally just take a bunch of them and smell it. And if you can smell those conifer phenols coming off, so you know when pine chips are really new, they smell like pine, or spruce smells like spruce, or fir smells like fir. This is an indication that it's not ready for composting. Those phenols themselves are antifungal, and they're going to stop some of that. They're also antimicrobial. They're going to stop some of those decomposition pathways from occurring. And so you want to make sure that your wood chips are sufficiently aged before you start composting with them. If you can, though, deciduous trees are going to be better. So if you live in a climate where there's lots of deciduous wood mulch around, I highly recommend that. And literally put 50% of the pile in wood mulch. And if you're building a static heap like this one, you're going to want to make sure that you're putting in decent layers. So if you put in, 2 pounds or 3 pounds of greens from your kitchen, put in 2 to 3 pounds of wood mulch. Have the wood mulch right beside the compost so that it's really easy. You're not having to go for a long distance to go and get those wood chips. Other carbon sources include straw, leaves, like I mentioned. So there's lots of different ways that you can get carbon into this pile. Don't be shy about the carbon. If you put lots of carbon in and there's enough moisture in your opinion, and it still doesn't get hot, you might be lacking on the nitrogen side of things. But it's way easier to add very small amounts of nitrogen than it is to have to come back from a stinky anaerobic pile. Basically, if your pile smells like any of the 4 gross smells, so I think it's puke, poop, what are the other ones? They're all amines, and I can't remember butyric acid. Anyways, I can't remember what the 4 are, but if it smells bad and you don't want to be around it, add carbon. The yields of a compost pile are microbes, fertility, heat, carbon, nutrients, H2O, water holding capacity, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrients. Now, a lot of people think that compost is all about adding fertility or fertilizer into the garden, but it's not that you're wrong in saying that, but it's missing the most important point of compost. It's actually been proven now that the carbon that emerges as a result of the decomposition and compost, the end product of a compost, doesn't last more than 3 to 4 years in the garden. It actually off-gases into CO2. And so it's actually a very short-lived amendment, if you will. The actual thing that compost does, compost is basically yogurt for the soil. It's a probiotic. And if you are managing your soil properly, you'll be adding in a biodiverse amount of probiotics to the soil through the use of compost extracts, and compost teas. And this is the benefit of compost. You will get all the other nutrients as well, but the main benefit is the inoculation of plant roots. And if people are interested, potentially, and you remind me at the end, we can go through a little bit more about how plants get nutrient out of the soil, if that's something of interest. Somebody can make a comment at the end there. So there's a lot of needs and yields of this compost pile. And then when we bring it all together, the goal of a needs and yields analysis is trying to find the Venn diagram, or the intersection points between the two elements that make the compost and the chicken happier together. As I said earlier, good designers are matchmakers. And so the chicken produces manure. In that manure is a bit of H2O, not a lot, but a little bit. In its manure, there are microbes, there's potassium, there's phosphorus, there's nitrogen, there's labor. Chickens actually produce labor. And then as a yield, the compost itself produces microbes, fertility, heat. It produces micronutrients, and it produces bugs or grubs. And so you can see there's potentially some interesting synergy there. Now, I want to ask a question to you guys and see what your responses are. But when you're putting a compost pile on your property, where is the first place that you generally put your compost pile? It'll be interesting to see what the lag is on the video here. So I'll keep talking a little bit, but I want you just to put it into the chat there. Where's the first place that you put a compost heap onto your property? And then I also want to ask another question, which is if you have chickens, where do you typically place the chicken coop? Okay, so generally speaking, when I go onto a property, I'm just going to change my screen share here before we go into the next. Hidden away near the back of the property. Robert, thanks, Robert. That's exactly right. Next to my neighbor's fence, somewhere the bears won't find it. Mine is right beside the chicken run, almost full sun. Okay, so there's all sorts of different answers there, and none are necessarily good or bad, but what I do find is that we typically find people's chicken coops as far away as possible from where they live, from their center of energy. And what I usually do as a consultant is I will go onto their property and I walk to the chicken coop, and then I walk to their compost heap, and I count the steps. And I'm a pretty big guy, and so I know that when I take a step, I'm taking a step that's about a yard or a meter long. Not quite, but almost there. And I count my steps, and then I ask the homeowner or the acreage owner, so how many times do you go to the compost heap every day? And they're like, oh, probably once a day. And you're going there and back. And what about the chicken coop? How many times are you going to the chicken coop every day? And they say, well, every day I got to go collect the eggs, or maybe twice a day sometimes. And then, given that I'm an engineer, I pull out my smartphone and I calculate that out, and I divide it by 1,000 to determine how many kilometers they're walking per year. And sure enough, they're walking a long distance. And sometimes it's really long. And inevitably, the homeowner will always say, well, it's good exercise. And I'm like, well, do you have any hobbies outside of composting and chicken coops? And they say, well, yeah, but I never have time to go mountain biking, or I never have time to go hiking in the mountains, or whatever, walk the dog, whatever your hobby or hobby is that you like to do to get exercise. I was like, well, what if we change the system around here so that we design some of the work out? And so here's your first saying for the evening. Work is a failure in design. Okay, so let that sink in a little bit. Now, it's not to say that there's no work in a permaculture system. There absolutely is. However, if you're having to do endless amounts of work, another saying a friend of mine uses, Dakota Cohen, is that, how does it go? Drudgery is the price of stupidity. So if you continue to do the same thing over and over again without changing the situation and things aren't getting better, you need to change your design. So we need to look at how to integrate these things, and we can see that the chickens want a lot of what the compost has to offer, and the compost wants a lot of what the chickens have to offer. Now, I need to know, or I need to give you guys another saying to think about, and this is really, really important. It's one of the most important sayings in permaculture, in my opinion, and that is, we want to do 100 hours of thinking for every hour of doing. And it's a little bit of a saying, and you're not necessarily always going to spend 100 hours thinking about every hour that you actually go and do something, but if you use it as a little bit of a guideline, I think it can inform your design a little bit. Whereas most people, what they want to do is do 100 hours of doing and 1 hour of thinking, and then they're constantly chasing their tail. And so what I want you guys to think about is, how can we apply this 100 hours of thinking for 1 hour of doing? And I have a story to tell you guys. A buddy of mine in Manitoba named Robert Guilford, amazing guy. He co-founded the Harvest Moon Society in southern Manitoba. I highly recommend checking it out if you're in Manitoba. It's an amazing place, amazing people. Decided that he was going to take this concept to reality. He wanted to actually observe something for a long period of time. And permaculture is all about observation, as you're starting to get a sense of. And so what he did was he actually sat down and he watched his chickens, and he said he watched them for 100 hours. He just kept watching them. And what he discovered is a really interesting behavioral pattern of chickens, which ended up saving him so much time. And so it really kind of brings this whole needs and yields and work is a failure in design and 100 hours of thinking and 1 hour of doing. And so what he noticed is that whenever chickens drink, they poop. And the reason that's important is that that observation allowed him to combine passive solar greenhouses and chickens together, which typically I would say is a no-no. The reason you typically don't put livestock into your passive solar greenhouse is because the manure and the urine that comes off of the livestock will produce ammonia gas, which can cause issues with your plants. As soon as plants detect the ammonia in the air, it actually burns their leaves. And so by doing this, he figured out why or when chickens poop. And then from there, he used it to create a directive in order to better design his chicken coop. And the reason that this is kind of important is that how many people here have been into a chicken coop that is just the most disgusting thing you've ever been in? The minute you walk in, you want to get out of there. The reason chicken coops are disgusting is because people hate cleaning them. People hate the dust, they hate the smell, they hate the odor. And so a lot of times I go into chicken coops and they've just been completely ignored because somehow they think that if they ignore it, the problem will somehow magically just disappear. Well, what Robert Guilford did was he put the chicken waterer right over top of the roost. And so whenever the chicken came in to drink inside of their little coop, they also got to get a drink of water, and then their poop fell down into one place. And so he was able to run his coop for an entire half to even a full year without changing the bedding pack on the bottom because it was not full of manure. Just through that simple observation that they pooped every time they drank. Now, there's a couple of other things that came out of it. He attached a passive solar greenhouse to the chicken coop, so the chickens were keeping the passive solar greenhouse warm, which again, there's a few things there that you have to be cautious about before you go and do that. He provided artificial light for his passive solar greenhouse, specifically for his tomatoes, which also gave the chickens some artificial light, which allowed them to continue producing eggs throughout the winter. So just some interesting ideas there. And I don't want you to take this as something you should necessarily go and do. I want you to use it more as an example of how you can use observation in order to make better design. And this concept of 100 hours of thinking and 1 hour of doing. So what if instead of putting our chicken coop and our compost piles on odd ends of the property, really far away, we figured out how to combine them together? Now, I want to ask one more question of compost. Why is it that you guys think that compost piles go to the end of the property? Just give that some thought. Why do compost piles go to the end of the property, as far away as possible? Unsightly. Okay, what else? Rodents. It's about looks. People put their gardens out back 42. They should be near the kitchen door. In a rural setting, vermin can be an issue, totally. To avoid the smell. Christine, that's exactly what I was going for. So if you have a bad smelling compost pile, what does that mean? Out of sight, out of mind. Not managed properly. Fear of uncertainty and doubt. Got it. Anna Eddy and her Soul Viva experiment, animals in the greenhouse. So if you have a smelly compost pile, you're probably not very good at composting, because if you have your compost pile near your house and it smells, what are you going to do about it? You're not going to live with the smell. So some people will move it away, and other people who are a bit more determined will figure out how to compost properly, because properly composting material shouldn't have an odor to it. So just something to think about. Smell is just a feedback mechanism. It's giving you information, and our job as designers is to take that information and put it to productive use, to figure out what that information is trying to tell us, and to anaerobic, Josh, totally, to figure out how to better utilize that information and put it to productive use and get better at what it is that you're doing. It's just a feedback mechanism. So let's go to the next slide here. So composts, compost needs, chickens need food, they need microbes, they need bugs, they yield feathers, manure, scratching, foraging, fighting. I'm not sure why there's shells in there, but oh yeah, eggshells, sorry. I'm losing my mind. Yeah, they produce eggshells. You could also say that they produce bones as well. There's lots of stuff that comes off the back end of a chicken system, and that can all be put to productive use into a compost system. So my question to you guys, and I'm not saying necessarily this is how you should go and design a chicken coop. I'm just using this as an analogy or a metaphor for how we can create better design. And so the ultimate chicken coop, why wouldn't we have a compost heap on the bottom with a trap door in it, a chicken nipple right here, so chickens could come into the chicken coop, come and drink from it. Their manure would all concentrate right here. When we're done, we happen to know that shit rolls downhill. And so when, instead of moving it out of the chicken coop, we just let it go down. We can put our food scraps down here with our carbon, and guess who's going to come down and manage it? The chickens will. We can have a rain tank on the side, which will capture water from the roof. As this tank gets full, or this tank needs water, we can pump it back up to here. So we've got gravity feed. We can run that pump off of a solar array. Even just a tiny little solar panel is all you need. We can have an automatic chicken door, an operable window, and it can kind of all come together. And so that the compost heat through the winter will help to keep the greenhouse warm. The chicken manure will keep the compost active. The chicken, or the compost, will actually get managed by the chickens. The trap door itself, we can have an opener on the front, a big, huge plug that comes out of the chicken coop. So we just take our rake, we pull a pulley, pull up the hinged roost, and then push with a rake all the carbon down onto the material and then fill it back up again. We just have to think about things a little bit more conscientiously. And when we do that, we can really design a lot of the work out of the system, essentially. And so work is a failure in design. And this is an example of what we can actually do in order to reduce the amount of work that, that we're currently doing, just by taking a little bit more time and thinking about design. So what I'd like you guys to do over this week, and if you send it to me at info@vergepermaculture.ca, I'll just put that into if you send me an email to that email address with what you've come up with, what I'd like you guys to do is I'd like you guys to choose 2 out of these elements. So I've got passive solar greenhouse, pond, annual garden, food forest, rain tank, and compost heap. And I would like you to do 2 of these elements, and I'd like you to understand the needs and yields of those 2 elements. So let's just choose passive solar greenhouse and pond as an example. So we do a needs and yields analysis like we did in the last slide, or last slides, I should say, for a passive solar greenhouse. And then we do a needs and yields analysis for a pond. And then I want you to come up with a conceptual plan, even though you know nothing about the property or the landscape, and figure out how a pond and a passive solar greenhouse works together. Then what I'd like you to do is produce a diagram. And the diagram doesn't have to be as fancy as my chicken coop. So we'll do one more quick example here. And then that diagram can basically just detail out what the system looks like, just with a simple concept plan. And then I'll take a look at it, and I'll put 2 or 3 of the best up for next week, and we can have a quick discussion as a group once those goes up. So we will go through that really quickly here. Let me just do a new share. All right. So let's just assume that you're going to choose food forest, and pond. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to do a needs and yields analysis for the food forest, and you're going to do a needs and yields analysis for the pond. And then out of that, I want you to design a food forest. So maybe you'll do a food forest in the shape of a shelter belt that is also in the shape of a U. So we call this a sun trap as a result of your needs and yields analysis, just as an example. And what ends up happening when you do this needs and yields analysis is you're going to end up finding that there are other opportunities to integrate things in here. So I want you to start with 2, but as you're doing it, you're more than welcome to add in other components that might make sense. So if this is south right here, we know that the sun is going to bring in energy right there. We know that ponds have reflection and thermal mass, so maybe we'll put in a kidney-shaped pond right here, right in the front. So any sun coming down into the pond is going to reflect back into the food forest. Maybe we put a shrub layer kind of in the front. So all these bigger trees are going to be fruit-bearing or nut-bearing trees, depending on where you live. And then now we've got this beautiful shelter right here. And so perhaps then what we do is we actually build out a little annual vegetable garden, okay? And who can think of something else that I can add into this system? Okay, so we've got an annual vegetable garden right there. We've got a pond. Maybe there's some fish in there. And maybe we can think about a compost pile. Yeah, good idea. Swales. Maybe even a chicken coop on the side right here. With a compost pile underneath it. And a couple, I can draw a chickens, maybe even some ducks in there. And so now we've got this fully integrated system that where one system feeds another system, and you create feedback mechanisms and cycles. So this is what I mean by a concept plan. So once you've done the needs and yields analysis that we've spoken about, then I want you to figure out how they might fit together. Remember, only choose 2 elements, okay? It gets too confusing when you start doing more, especially the first time. And the 2 elements that I want you to choose are out of the list that I've given you guys. All right, yeah, and horses for manure. Good job, Frankie. All right, so I'm curious, do you guys have any questions around this before we move on to the next slide? And then we're going to go back into Q&A at the end of the session this evening. Any questions about needs and yields before we move on? So hopefully that made sense. Now, I made a comment earlier while you guys are putting up any questions around needs and yields right now, because I really hope that you guys take this and actually run an exercise with it. The thing that I want you guys to think about is this idea of being a matchmaker. And so just like in the same way that when you put 2 of your friends together on a date, they may not like each other. And so we have the power of placement, but we don't necessarily have the power of conductivity or connection. And so we need to be conscientious of that. If you're going to place things together, we need to be ready to make changes as they go along to accept feedback. So Noah's Gardens, aesthetics and design. Great question, Noah. You know, I'm an engineer, I'm not a landscape architect. And so I don't think about aesthetics first. I usually think about them second or third. But my saying is that if I'm done at the end of my project and it's ugly, then I failed. So it needs to look good. It can't look crappy. But sometimes we drive projects and design purely by aesthetics to the detriment of the project. And I can give you lots of examples of that. And there's actually one coming up right now. So I don't take it first. Now, the justification for that is that when you go into a natural forest, nobody goes into a natural forest and says, oh man, this is unkept and this is ugly. They always are in awe of how it looks. And so my systems are all about trying to mimic nature, mimic the aesthetic of nature, mimic the function of nature, but then add in some additional components that serve or benefit my own needs and yields analysis. I mean, ultimately, sustainable human habitat is understanding our needs and yields and understanding all the needs and yields of the individuals around us. Joel Salatin says that good farming is multi-species negotiation. And we're just negotiating with animals, we're negotiating with plants, we're negotiating with buildings, we're negotiating with mechanical systems. We can do all of these same ideas, use all of these same ideas to design all of the systems that we require as humans in order to live a technologically advanced, happy, sustainable life. And that's the whole premise behind needs and yields. Now I'm curious, what element is common, or let me say it a different way, what do all of these elements require or have a need for that's common to all of them? And while we're waiting for you guys to answer, the common need amongst all of these elements that you guys are looking at If you're watching and you got something out of that last little bit there, I'd love for you guys to hit the like button. If it's nice feedback for me to be able to see if things are going well for you guys. Okay, Frankie, water. Absolutely, Frankie. You get 100 points for that. Water is the common element. And what's really interesting about water is that it's usually the last thing that we think about. In fact, most present day design focuses on getting rid of the water as fast as possible through drainage mechanisms. And then we spend enormous amounts of money and energy to pump that water back up to our systems. And Frankie said it a bit earlier when she said, water, access, and structures. Okay, so that's the mantra that we use in all permaculture design. Now, I want to add one more layer onto this, and then we're going to get into another, we're going to wrap up the evening and then go to Q&A. So this is a photo from a colleague of mine, two colleagues of mine, who I absolutely love. And if you've never checked out their website, I highly recommend it, milkwood.net. Milkwood Permaculture, amazing people, Nick and Kirsten. If you ever get down to Australia, or if you're from Australia and you've never heard of these folks, you need to get in touch with them. They are the bomb. Amazing. I can't say enough good things about it. So this is a gravity chicken run that they had on their property, and at the top they had a straw bale chicken coop, and as we all know, nutrients go downhill, and so they would move all of the compost scraps from the chickens to the top of the hill. They would move all of the carbon and mulch to the top of the hill. And then as a result of the scratching and labor action provided by the chickens, as that mulch rolled down the hill, it composted. And once it got to the bottom of the hill, it was compost. And so a very, very low energy intensive composting system that benefits from both the chickens, but also the slope. And so when we think about needs and yields, we also have to take the landscape into account in order to really get a lot of effectiveness and efficiency out of the system. Now, if you're really smart, you'd put a garden at the very bottom of this. And so as soon as the compost was done, you could just pitchfork the compost onto the garden on the other side. So when we take slope, needs and yields, things just kind of start to work effortlessly together. Now, if you're calling from Alberta, another place that I highly recommend checking out is Grassroots Family Farms. You can Google them. Dakota Cohen and his family have done amazing work on this property. They offer an annual tour of their farm, and you can get a lot of these concepts in real life on a farm scale if you live here in Alberta. And Dakota is one of our main teachers for our permaculture design course. And so he really brings this farming component, larger scale farming, into fruition when he teaches the PDC with us. He teaches a presentation called Gardening for Livestock, which is a full day program within our permaculture design course. You can get a sense of what that's like. We have a Gardening with Livestock video on our YouTube channel. If someone could pull that up, that'd be great so that other people can take a look at it. It's a 1 hour presentation that Dakota and I did live on Zoom. And you'll get a lot of insight out of it. It's well worth your time to watch that. So if somebody can pull that, put that into the chat window for me, that I'd be much appreciated. So this is called a Gravity Chicken Run. Again, check out milkwood.net, especially if you're in Australia. And just before we go to questions, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this structure here, which we're just finishing up the design on right now. This is our latest passive solar greenhouse. It's missing a roof. It basically combines a passive solar greenhouse, which is the front part, and inside there we've got a food forest, but it's subtropical in nature. We've got a wood-fired heated hot tub. We've got an annualized geosolar system, which basically stores the heat underground. So it's taking the excess heat from the greenhouse during the day and putting it underground. The hot tub in the corner there, which is hard to, oh no, you can see it in the one image there, provides gray water when people are done bathing in it. It provides thermal mass. It provides a place to hang out, as we talked about, is nice in a greenhouse. It provides a heat source. In the middle of the greenhouse, we've got a canning kitchen. I think that canning should be done in a structure similar to this, where humidity is not a really big issue. And so as humidity is produced in the canning kitchen, it just ends up in the greenhouse, which is of no consequence. It actually benefits things. And then to the back there, we've got what's called, it's called a root cellar. A root cellar is a place that we store the food. So we produce it in the greenhouse, we prepare it in the kitchen, and we store it in the root cellar. And as a result of that, the root cellar itself produces stale air as things decompose within it, whether it's potatoes or various other elements inside of it. And so we actually have a set of earth tubes which bring in cold or warm air, pump it underground through pipes, either preheat it in the wintertime, so when it's really cold outside, it'll bring the temperature of the air up, or pre-cool it in the summertime to keep the root cellar cold. So it's basically an earth fridge, if you will, with a little bit more sophistication. And as we pull cool or slightly warmed air into this root cellar, we push it through these ducts here. And so in the wintertime, these ducts are going to push slightly warmed stale air into the greenhouse, which will provide additional CO2 and some warming for these plants. And then there'll be fresh, cool air in the root cellar. And then in the summertime, this will be cooled air, which will actually provide a bit of a cooling yield, plus that CO2 for those plants as well. So as you can see, the reason I finished with this is that we can apply all of these same concepts of needs and yields into the way we design our structures as well. It doesn't just have to be gardens and food forests. It doesn't just have to be biological elements. It can also be physical elements as well. And ideally, we're bringing in the biology, we're bringing in the physical elements, and eventually, when we get good enough at it, we start thinking about this in terms of community and how we build relationships amongst each other, because we all ultimately have needs and yields. And I think that as we move more into this digital age, which is ironic because I'm teaching on YouTube, we need to work harder at building real relationships amongst people. One of the best things that has occurred to me over the years as a permaculture teacher is that for every dollar I have in the bank, I have $10,000 in relationships. I left a very lucrative career in the oil and gas industry to pursue permaculture. However, my resilience has improved exponentially because I'm surrounded by the most amazing people in the world. You could not ask for a better community of people than I have here in Calgary and right across Canada for that matter. And so I'm just shouting out to all the amazing people that have taken our programs. If you're on tonight, great. I'm so appreciative of you guys having touched my life. You guys are now students of mine as well, so welcome. Yeah, it's an amazing journey. And I think that it's very easy to kind of wrap your head around the physical design components, but community is the ultimate form of resilience. And if you don't have it, you're not resilient. So I encourage you to figure out how to do it. And we will talk about community again throughout the course a couple of times. And if you guys have any questions about community, I'm happy to address that as well. So thanks so much for participating tonight. We're going to go to questions. And actually, I just realized I've got a few more slides here. I forgot. So we've talked about water being central to life. I think that I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to, because we're at the end of the hour here, guys, and I'll edit this out for the YouTube video that we're going to post up later this evening. And I'm going to postpone to, I'm going to go to questions right now. So you guys have a full 30 minutes of questions before we end. And I will add this water component into the next section if that makes sense for folks. So feel free to post any questions up into the chat panel, and I'll answer them. I'll be here till 7:30. And while I'm waiting, there's a delay there, just highly recommend that you watch some of the other YouTube videos on my channel. It's free information. If you're not on our email list, I send out a weekly-ish email with all sorts of interesting information. Yeah, I really thank you guys for spending a whole hour with me tonight on YouTube. If you found this interesting, I really appreciate the likes down below. And I'm just going to, as you guys are prepping your questions, I'm just going to move. Just going to move to our summary screen here. So today we talked about integration and design. Each element performs many functions. Every element is supported by many others. We did a needs and yields exercise, and I hope that you guys can take some time this week to do your own needs and yields exercise and share it with me. And next week, we're going to talk more about water as a master element in design. next week, in addition to water, we're going to talk about the concept of producing no waste and how that's probably one of the best ways to come up with a permaculture business is to find a waste stream. We're going to talk about my favorite books on rainwater harvesting, how to do a site water analysis, and we're going to talk about the principle of capturing and storing energy, another one of my favorites. Where to get more information. So the show notes for this will be at the bottom of the YouTube video after tonight's show. I'll make sure I post that up there. You can join our mailing list. We've got free e-courses on our website, which will also be in the show notes later. We've got passive solar greenhouse case studies. So if you want to learn more about these, we've got 5 passive solar greenhouse case studies, including mine. We've got live Q&A on Mondays right now. So we're doing another live show at noon on Monday. On Friday this week at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, we're going to be talking about rainwater harvesting. So if you have any questions about that, we'll do about 20 minutes of content and then go over to Q&A. We've got live training. We've got 3 PDCs happening this year. So you can take a permaculture design course from us. I'd love to see you guys up here if you want to come and take a permaculture design course in Canada. We've got online training. So we actually have tailored webinar specifically called Permaculture Pro, where you can get all of your answers, all of your questions answered in a private webinar, a much easier platform than YouTube to operate under. And then we also have consulting. So how to support this course? Again, you can hit the like button. You can share this on social media. I love it when you guys leave your comments below. And if you got value from this presentation, there is a donate button that you'll see on the show notes a little bit later. So thanks so much, guys. Let's get into those questions. Okay, so Tim, agreed. There's no substitute for meaning too. Absolutely. Robert, where do we find the notes? Robert, I'm not sure which notes you're referring to. I'm happy to provide you with some notes. If it's the show notes below the YouTube video, I will post this YouTube video back onto YouTube a little bit later after I've edited it, and I will make sure that there are show notes below. Where do I begin? LOL, Frankie. I'll just keep going. Frankie, I have to say I really appreciate all your comments on the YouTube channel. Definitely have noticed you placing lots of them up there, so thanks for being such a great fan, and keep them coming. And if you have any specific questions, make sure that you post them up there. Kathy, my garden and some infrastructure predates my interest in permaculture. How do I integrate swales into the existing landscape with stuff in the way? Kathy, you may not need to put swales in. You know, if you've got really good soil, soil is one of the most amazing water harvesting elements. It really comes down to, you know, what your property looks like right now. Retrofitting an existing property is actually surprisingly easy if there's a lot of existing infrastructure, because you only have so many things that you can do. So it depends on how many things you're willing to move. For sure, you want to be harvesting rainwater for irrigating of your crops, and there's all sorts of stuff that you can learn around that. I highly recommend coming to the program on Friday at 3 o'clock Mountain Standard Time for our rainwater harvesting conversation. There's a ton of YouTube videos out on my channel that you can watch, which should give you some clues as well. And perhaps there's an opportunity to go through you know, another example. In fact, at the end of this program, we're going to be going through multiple case studies. And so I think you'll get some insights around those case studies as well. Frankie, I've learned so much. Thank you, Rob. Oh, you're more than welcome. So happy to have you. Veta or Vita, I don't know if you can, Vita, if you can just confirm that I'm pronouncing your name properly so I don't mess it up. I apologize if I'm not saying it right. Maybe you can spell it in a way that kind of shows me how to enunciate it properly or pronounce it. Any more resources for root cellars? So there are great resources out there. I actually have some neat resources that I'm working on root cellars, but I'll make sure that I announce it to my newsletter and also to YouTube once it's up. There's some great books in the Calgary library system, so I'm sure up in Northern Alberta that you'd have access to them. I'd have to look the title up specifically, but yeah, just check your library, get a couple of the books out, and if you find one that you like, then you know, by all means buy it. I'll see if I can look up which book I I got out of the library here, and if I remember, I'll put it in the show notes for tomorrow. And if I don't, you can bother me and just remind me, and I'll see what I can do about that. What about higher biodiversity what about higher biodiversity makes it desirable? So, hey guys, when you're asking questions, make sure you really fully describe the question that you're asking so that I get a better idea of what it is that you really want me to address. But let me give you an example about biodiversity that really struck me. And this is an example that Bill Mollison gave. So we have this saying that diversity creates stability, okay? But, and a lot of ecologists will tell you this as well, that the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more stable it is. And the real reason, and we talked about this in the last session, maybe I'll just change the share here. So we talked about this concept last time. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. There we go. All right, so when we look at ecosystems, ecosystems function in webs. And so every element in an ecosystem is part of that web. Okay, and every element is connected to every other element. And it's these connections that create stability in an ecosystem. And if we want to think about it a little bit differently, this is kind of like, if we think about the industrial system where we have source, so this could be oil, or it could be industrial agriculture, it could be any number of resources that we extract. And we use something once, okay? So think about plastic packaging as an example. And as soon as it's done, it goes straight to sink or the landfill. Okay, whereas in ecosystems, every waste product is a feedstock for another system. Now, it turns out that a web like this, and the best analogy we can give to a web is actually a fishing net, can lose roughly 50 to 60% of its connections, and it will still function. And so webs are generally far more resilient in that they can work far better. Let me see if I can get a better shot on this. It doesn't look like it's focusing very much here. There we go. And so webs will actually function better. Now, diversity itself is not enough, okay? So what elements actually have high diversity? Well, we can say that zoos have high diversity, right? Because there's lots of different elements in a zoo. But the difference between a zoo and this ecosystem is that zoos don't have what we call interactive diversity. This is interactive diversity, and it's so, so important. If you don't have these niches interacting with each other, then you don't have stability. And that's the main reason that diversity is important. If we think about a wheat field, which is the exact opposite of a diverse ecosystem, it only takes one disease to knock the whole system out. Or it only takes a small amount of a lack of rainwater to knock the whole system out. Whereas when you have a forest, forests actively seek water from deep below, and they partner with fungi. Really interesting fact, when you have a tree that's growing and it puts its root system down, did you know that the fungi will increase the surface area by up to 800 times? Okay, so what that means is that a standard tree root system will have 800 times the surface area available to it when it partners with fungi. And so that's an amazing example of why diversity is really important. When we use crop-based agriculture, we don't get that same level of stability because we don't have the level of diversity. All right, let's keep adding. Yields analysis, I don't get it. Okay, Petrus, if you want to ask me additional question, I'm happy to go into more detail about it. I'm happy to do another example. Let me know what it is that you don't get about needs and yields analysis. Frankie, you taught me water access structures. Okay, great. First before building, absolutely. I'm finding that many of the basic ideas of permaculture, including the more social ones, are tremendously well practiced in the rural South. That's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. It's amazing. There's a lot of traditional knowledge in permaculture, and we've just forgotten about it. Tim, your passive solar greenhouse package is fantastic. Yeah, if you're interested in passive solar greenhouse design, we're doing an online course, which we'll be announcing to YouTube and to our newsletter here in the next couple of weeks. So if you're on our newsletter, you're going to hear about that. It's an incredible course. We just recorded it. I'm really excited to release it. We've built a digital design tool to help making passive solar greenhouse design really, really simple. Do you have prices on your website for classes? Marissa, absolutely. If you go to the Verge Permaculture website, which is kind of funny because I actually have an email coming out on Friday, is actually a bit hard to find right now because Google has recently delisted us, which kind of ties nicely into tonight's conversation about not putting all your eggs into one basket and having resilience. So I'm going to put our website in here. It's interesting how much power Google has over our websites. And we have to be very cautious about putting all of our eggs into one basket in that way. But you can go to our website, and if you go to the courses page, then you'll find all the information that you need about our courses. Frankie, I'm 21 hours away. Doable. Awesome. Well, I'd love to see you. Philip Brown, rainwater harvest. I painted my downspouts dark brown. Color works with the house, which prevents freeze over winter. Absolutely. So what people don't realize this, but color changes the albedo of an element. And so albedo is essentially the amount of energy that gets absorbed versus reflected. And so, yeah, having darker downspouts and eaves troughs or rain gutters will actually change how it interacts with the ice. Totally. Robert, you answered it with the show notes. Thanks for a well done presentation. Okay, thanks, Robert. Gabby, not a question, but more of a thank you. Listening to the talk reassures me that we're doing thus far on our property and they're on the right path. So I just want to shout out to Gabby. Gabby and Christine are friends of mine, and they have a website, which Gabby, you can for sure put up into the chat there. I think it's Leaving Desks for Dirt. They have an incredible story. They also have transitioned their careers from oil and gas and engineering to rural Manitoba, and they are just so inspiring. And so I highly recommend you check out their website. Gabby, make sure you put it up there. I was looking at it earlier this evening. In fact, you know what? I'm going to do it for you, just in case you're too shy to do it yourself. Highly recommend checking them out. And if you guys are in Manitoba, shoot them a line. They're amazing people. Marissa, thank you for providing the community this hour and time for questions. This has been such a blessing. Awesome. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Marissa. Noah's Gardens, how to introduce permaculture into a front yard in the suburban area where people insist on manicured landscapes. You know, Noah, this is a great question. And I had a really interesting learning early in my career where I did exactly what you're talking about doing for a client. And I showed up with these giant garden beds. They were actually wicking beds, and they looked amazing. I thought they did. They were made out of cedar, and they were chunky, and I thought they were very aesthetically pleasing, and so did my client. And we started installing it, and the neighbor actually came over and said, what are you doing? This is an investment property. Like, what are you putting in here? And I said, oh, we're putting in a vegetable garden. She's like, well, can't you plant some flowers? And I said, well, vegetables have flowers too. And by the way, tonight's show is for the bees. So plant your flowers in your gardens, get the diversity up there. And she gave me a really hard time over this garden that I was putting in. And by the time it was all done, she came back over. She said, wow, I can't believe how good this looks. Can I hire you to do my property? And I told her it was $800 an hour because I didn't want to work for her. But the point is that permaculture is about repair. It's about regeneration. It's about fixing things. And so when you're living in an environment where people don't think it's broken, you're going to really struggle with trying to convince them that it needs to be repaired. And so we actually live in one of the lowest socioeconomic class neighborhoods in Calgary, and we have no issues here. In fact, I've had multiple people come to my house just walking by, and they literally start crying when they see, like, I'm not even joking about that. I'll be in my front yard doing a chop and drop or a movie or something, and they'll sit down on my front garden bed and they will start crying because there are so many bees and ladybugs and bugs and diversity in my little garden amongst this desert of, front lawns. I actually have a neighbor down the road that has a plastic lawn. So work where you're invited. If you end up putting a whole bunch of energy into places where you're not welcome, a lot of that energy will go to sink and it won't be put to productive use. And that's kind of my lesson. It sounds a little bit nihilist, but the upside is that there's plenty of places that need repair, that need people to go out and do really good work. So that's where I would focus. How do you introduce, okay, next question. Rhymes with Vita. Okay, thanks, Vita. Perfect. Karen Seville, do you know how to harvest rainwater from Calgary street gutters? So that's a good question, and you have to be really careful about that. A lot of the brake pads and debris coming off of our cars is actually pretty toxic, and so you can potentially do it. And the city of Calgary is actually getting very progressive around this. They've got a number of curb cuts and rain gardens all over the city, and they're using it to grow mulch basins. So they're actually cleaning the water, they're creating more diversity, they're growing shrubs. They're not necessarily edible, but the city of Calgary is doing it. And there may be some opportunities in the future to integrate that into your own property. Okay, Richard, got here late. Glad you sorted out the echo from last week. So appreciate your energy and knowledge. You've answered my question so far. Thanks. Awesome, Richard. I'm glad that you came. We'll make sure we put this up so you can watch the front end of this tomorrow. Jam, is your talk that you're doing Friday, rainwater harvesting, would it be relative for a very different climate, cool, temperate, no snow in Australia? Absolutely. I've got a great infographic that I'm going to share with you guys, which kind of breaks it all down. And I'm going to go through something called the anatomy of a rain tank. And so you'll get a lot of ideas around that. There will be some cold climate stuff in there, but I know that you'll get some value out of it. Christine, thanks for all the info. Looking forward to trying the exercises and the rest of the talks. Awesome, Christine. Glad to have you. Share with your friends. Jam, thanks for your time and efforts in making this time and material available to so many. Awesome. Thanks, Jam. Logan V0410, excellent description of diversity as a web. Thank you. Sabian 00, what are your thoughts on aquaponics? Great question. And I think that it's a bit of a long answer, but generally speaking, I don't think you can beat soil. I think that soil is the ultimate expression of resilience. And I actually have something called The Story of Soil, which I'm going to share with YouTube here in not too much time, one of my future videos. So watch out for that. So it's really hard to replace soil. I think aquaponics can make a ton of sense in Australia. I think it can make sense in a passive solar greenhouse if you design it in the right way. But based on the research that I've done into aquaponics, you're always having to add minerals in order to deal with deficiencies in the system. And in addition to that, if one thing goes wrong in the system, for example, the power goes out, you can lose an entire crop of plants, but also an entire crop of fish. So it's really not very resilient when you compare it to a regular garden. It does appeal to our techno desire though, and I've definitely been infected with that with regards to aquaponics in the past as well, but I've really struggled to make it work. Another test that you can do on any of these systems is, does it produce more energy out than it consumes? And so the industrial food system takes 10 calories of energy in fossil fuels, cooking, transportation, and in exchange we get 1 calorie out. So it's a very negative balance. So I'd like somebody to do some research on whether aquaponic systems are net positive energy producers. What are your, okay, next. Rob, you started in your ebook that permaculture is engineering, physics, biology, anthropology, and architecture all in one, rolled into one. You're absolutely right, Frankie. That's exactly what I said. It kind of brings all my interests into one system, which is why I think it's so fantastic. So with that being said, although I am new to permaculture, however, I'm always pounding permaculture into my social networking. And not to get off subject, I think permaculture will solve racism. Awesome, I think so too. You know, I realized last week that I kind of skipped over the ethics piece. So it's a great time for me to just add that in. So permaculture centers around ethics, which is care of people, care of earth, and return of surplus. Now, the environmental movement of the last 30 to 40 years, I think completely failed because it didn't take care of people. It tried to take care of the planet, but it didn't take care of people. And so I think your comment is totally true. What I say is that we all want our kids to go to university. We all want them to grow up healthy. We all want them to be loved. You know, when we try and come down to a universal set of ethics that we can all agree on, those are the three right there. And it doesn't matter what color of skin you have. It doesn't matter what religion you believe in or don't believe in. It doesn't matter what your career is. Those are three things that we can all agree on unless you're a sociopath. The last principle, which is return of surplus, is that when you have enough, you give back. Okay, and so this is an example of me providing a return of surplus to a bunch of people. We also have a mentorship program that we offer. It's not really on our website, but we do mentor students after our programs, which is a form of return of surplus. And so built into that as well is this concept of 7 generations thinking. So how are the actions that I'm taking today going to impact 7 generations down the road? And that's a really important quality of life statement for me. That's something that really resonates with me and something that I think about a lot when I'm making decisions in my life. I use those 3 ethics a lot. So thanks for stating that, Frankie. Although I'm not ranting about it, but it makes sense to me, totally. Marissa, okay, great, thank you. Frankie Robertson, please don't get offended. Absolutely not. I'm not going to get offended. It takes a lot more to offend me, and that was not offensive anyways, so no problem. Not designed towards one ethnic group, but if we're always working towards permaculture, we don't have time to fight. Absolutely. Okay. Perhaps I view the world through rose-colored glasses. Well, we need more people to do that, Frankie. I started reading a book, A Pattern Language, that you recommended. Awesome. Logan, nice color. Rose beats many other tones and shades. Gabby, thanks for the kind words, Rob. No problem. Rianne Anderson, I was hoping you would mention bees. That's what this is for. All right. Getting to the end of the questions here. I hope that you won't think our designs are in the infantile stages because it's going to require some thinking time. No problem. We all start somewhere. JM, our food system would grind to a halt without bees. Absolutely. Mary, water is the master element, something we did not understand when we built our house 30 years ago. Well, there may be an opportunity to make that better. Mushrooms are helping the bees stay healthy. Absolutely, Vita. There's a great video by Paul Stamets that you can watch all about that. Mary Ellen Kirby, we've spent the last 3 decades with big water issues, where it is and where it isn't. How to start fixing it? Well, the first thing that you need to do is you need to map out your property. You need to understand the contours, where the water's coming from, where it's going to, and then when we know that, then we can start using more of a Tai Chi approach to move the water from one place to another. Not always moving it, but sometimes there's nothing we can do. Sometimes it's just a type 1 error and we have to kind of start over again, which really sucks. But we can't know that until we've actually done our due diligence. And so one of the first things we do when we consult for somebody is we start with a contour map. And that usually involves a drone or LiDAR mapping. And I'm going to give you guys some case studies at the end of this program as to how we go about doing that. So there may be some light shed on your problems there. JM, thanks. Juanita, I hope I pronounced that right. Or hopefully, I apologize if I mispronounced your name. If you use permaculture principles in daily life, you'll be surprised in that you will produce less waste. Absolutely, I agree with that. Okay. So true, Rob. Thank you. LOL, sociopath. Okay, Logan. Many of my peers actively rejected the environmental movement because the movement appeared to skip over the people piece. Absolutely. Frankie Robertson. So much to learn. I'm intrigued. Jordan Saunders. Hey, Jordan. Nice to see you. Another amazing person that has come through my life. What is your best tip on creating work-life balance when you are so clearly driven and passionate about what you do? How do you avoid burnout, or do you avoid it? That's a really good question, Jordan. Kids, I think, is the best way to answer that. They keep me balanced. They, as you know, because you've got a bunch of nephews and nieces, they don't stop nagging you until you pay attention to them. And if you're smart, and because you're also a Vipassana meditator, I know, you come back into a state of consciousness, hopefully, and realize that you're not focusing on the most important thing, which is not work. I think part of it is that you work in something that you have a passion for, so it doesn't feel like work. And then you create checks and balances in your life. So one thing that I've had to do is I actually purposefully leave my cell phone at home, so I won't take it with me. And I know you live in a place where cell phones don't even work, which is great. But if I'm not taking a smartphone with me, then I'm not thinking about it. And actually, I'm far more conscientious and conscious as a human. This last year has been very busy for me, I have to admit. And we're releasing a book. Our first book ever is coming out at the end of this year on rainwater harvesting, which I'm pretty excited about. Our consulting business has taken off. There's just a lot of things pulling at me all the time. But I still work less than I would have had I worked 9 to 5 in downtown Calgary. So Vipassana meditation is the other thing I think that has really helped me to maintain some level of balance in my life. Although, again, I have to engage that right now. It's been very busy the last couple of months, but it goes in cycles, and you just have to kind of take it as it comes and check in with yourself on a regular basis. Next question. Any tips on how to deter deer? Living here in Kelowna, they even come up to our patio. I've had to clean their poo away. Dogs. Get an outdoor dog. Don't let the dog inside. And that dog will make sure that the deer do not come near you. And if you can't let your dog off your property, you can put in a visible fence. That's probably the cheapest alternative. You could also use deer fencing, which is not nice to look at. Little brother, have you employed those worm casting tubes? Are they worthwhile in Calgary? I have tried them. Not a big fan. I think you're better off just to compost the worms inside, or compost with the worms inside, and then bring the worm castings out. A little brother, Frankie, I can't wait for your book. Nor can I. It's almost done. I've got a couple more weeks to get it finished here. So we're just working on that right now. Does it count as a meditation if I sit on the porch and just enjoy the view and nad the life? And, you know, meditation comes in many forms, and I'm not a spiritual teacher, and I'm not here to tell you how you should or shouldn't meditate. I just know that it's been really valuable in my life, and Vipassana is the path that I chose, but I know there's lots of them out there. Richard, so I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to call her a night. So how does one deal with the pollution, mostly air, from a very busy street that my house faces? Can't have trees because of the power lines. Have about 15 feet sloped lawn to the sidewalk. My take on it, Richard, is that we live in a chemical soup. There's pollution everywhere. And if you're buying food from the grocery store, you don't know what pollution was around that farm that those vegetables were grown on. So better the devil that you know than the devil that you don't. So don't worry about it too much. And, you know, I think we're going to live in a time where pollution is actually going to decrease in the next 2 decades. So it's a really exciting time to live on planet Earth. We're going to look up to the skies in 20 years from now, and we're going to see clear skies like we've never seen them before. So use some of that pollution to produce vegetables. Vegetables want that CO2, and then make sure that you're cleaning your vegetables off if you've got any kind of dust or particulate. It doesn't really matter where you grow vegetables in the city, you're going to get pollutants on it. Okay, just a couple more comments. Thank you, Rob, for an awesome lesson and clarity. Everyone, peace. Looking forward to seeing everyone on Friday. Have 100 hours of thinking to inquire. LOL. Peace. Amen on dealing with the soup. Totally. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much. I just want to finish off with a quick closing. Just remember that bees are attracted to honey and not to vinegar. It's really easy to get depressed about the state of the world out there, but we all need to keep a positive frame of mind. when we are working with positivity and looking at the solutions and not at the problems, the problem is always a solution. It engages the front part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, and that's where all the creativity comes from. And this world needs creative and positive individuals, because as you get positive and creative within your own life, you'll end up attracting other people into those systems as well, and they will start following suit. And that is the only way that we're going to create change. So thank you guys so much for spending an hour and a half on YouTube with me tonight. I hope you got some value out of it. Please hit the like button below if it was really good for you. And like I said, I'll be on YouTube Friday at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time talking about rainwater. Next Monday at noon, we'll be talking about some interesting topic. And then part 3 of this course next Wednesday, and then there'll be some other topic for the following Friday. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you guys real soon.